So one, a classic, another argument then is to not go to Mars or not set up a colony, is that we may end up contaminating the planet. It's kind of like a planetary protection argument.
We should leave it in its sort of primal, pristine state.
Yeah.
To protect its scientific value, basically.
Yes. And I think that's, I mean...
It's not a bad reason. There's a lot of really important stuff we can learn from Mars because it's so similar to Earth in so many ways, or at least was. Learning about the early sort of history of the solar system, learning about why planets change in the way they do, why we've ended up like this.
But a lot of those, some of those, not all of those are related to biology and having to keep the planet pristine. You can learn a lot from that. If you covered the planet in a city and you drilled down and the only science you were doing was deep subsurface stuff, you might contaminate the deep subsurface life, but you're going to learn loads from the geology and all that sort of stuff about the planetary evolution. But the key thing is you don't want to seed it with some like, or contaminate some deep subsurface aquifer that we can't give a definite there was not life here on Mars answer, because although it may be very hard to ever get a proper answer. That say there's no life on Mars at all. Okay, none. Now we go there and we keep doing this drilling. We keep finding, and we've spent 100 years and we've not found anything on Mars. There's still a possibility that we just haven't come across the right thing. But I think at that point
we would narrow it down, and we wouldn't just be doing it randomly either. You'd be you'd be strategically drilling. And as you learn more about the planet, you'd learn where to drill and the most likely locations to search and all that kind of stuff.
So I think
we would get to a point where we're reasonably confident that there's nothing there.
And I think to do those types of large scale surveys to really get an answer, to really get the negative, basically. The positive might be really easy to get. You do one drill, like, oh, fucking hell, there's loads of weird stuff in it. But the negative might be harder. You would need a colony. You would need something large scale. You'd need people there for long periods of time to do that. I also think it's possible to do those sorts of things and still to have a colony and and engineer out the risk of contamination.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we do that.
We do that anyway.
We do that now. Like,
we do it in Antarctica
all the time. I mean, both you and I work in sort of microbiology labs and have gone doing microbiology sampling.
Sure.
And you don't worry. I mean, you take steps to make sure you don't contaminate your samples when you take them.
Yeah.
But we don't worry about the fact that, okay, there's a bunch of people over there, or there's like a city down the road, or like, whatever. Yeah. It's just it's just fine.
But it's a different level of risk, though.
It is a different level of risk.
Because in those environments, if we're sampling, just to say we're sampling a hot spring, and we've got a bunch of people walking over, you may end up getting some human DNA or some human bacteria off your skin that floats into the hot spring, but it's going to be overlain and probably destroyed in a hot spring by all the organisms that are in there that are specially adapted to those environments. Maybe that's the case on Mars. They're very extreme. It would be very obvious. But the key thing is, if you've got an environment on Mars that has nothing in it and it's an open habitable zone, and life just like goes crazy, it would not take long for stuff to grow in a body of water, say, that's got some nutrients in it, just never had life in it. We would never get that answer, which is a really important answer of finding that Mars, even though it was habitable, never was inhabited.
So the question is it possible to engineer out that risk?
Level of risk? Yeah, probably.
Maybe.
I think it probably is.
But as you get more and more people there, it's going to be harder and harder.
Yes, that's true.
And it probably will get to a point where it's not possible anymore. I'd imagine.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I would get to a point where it
especially if
possible.
sort of normal people, quote unquote, are just moving there by their thousands,
to
pursue their
people
lives.
to make the pizzas.
Yeah.
Like they aren't going to particularly care about how contaminated the planet gets.
No.
There's still, if you design all the habitats though, very specifically, because people aren't going to be building their own habitats to start with.
Not to start with.
Or for a long time, really.
No, I mean, but it probably will get to a point where they are. I mean, I don't mean like literally you go out with like a pickaxe and start hacking away at the rock and building your own habitat.
No, sure.
But
other companies, it will spread and it will become... You'll be able to regulate it, but you can never be 100% sure that people are doing it perfectly.
People might go out in like a rover sort of convoy and just decide, I'm going to build a habitat in this crater. Yeah. And plant a flag and call it name it after me, like Markville or something.
That'd be a shell. So I think you're right. I think it would get to a point where you can't
Markopolis.
Sorry. You can't be sure in Markopolis that Markopolis would not fuck up the whole of the aquifer system in the deep subsurface of
That's
Mars.
why we're there in the first place.
You would be responsible for
we're going to dig a well.
Screwing up like a century, it's like 3 centuries worth of astrobiology, into the future, because we can't get to another place that's got such a pristine environment.
We're just going to dig a well down to the aquifer and just flush all the toilets from the colony down the well.
Get rid of that.
See you later, Mars.
Just do a big pit and you're just chucking like bananas and everything down with the crap.
Contaminate it.
Yeah, just landfill. Just a big landfill site on Mars. So I think you're right. I think probably not. I think it's probably impossible to totally negate that. So then where do you go from there?
Is that a big enough reason to not go?
Yeah, it probably necessitates a focused scientific program to make a good effort at answering that question and getting to a point where most people are the scientific community is reasonably comfortable that there hasn't been life on Mars.
Yeah,
and that's a fairly big effort. It's a big effort. It's a whole planet.
Yeah, the rules are already in place now. I mean, planetary protection exists, and every mission has to adhere to it. Yeah. So presumably the first few generations of manned missions will also have really stringent planetary protection guidelines. So it's not like new rules will have to be implemented. They'll have to be obviously adapted for human missions.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's the only real way
planetary
that
protection is
going
to go out the window, please.
It's going to go out the window eventually, yeah. But I think you're right. We're gonna have to take it slowly and somehow work with the scientific community to make sure that by the time thousands of people are moving there just to live out their lives and do whatever, build Markopolis, that by that point that we are fairly confident that we've learned what we need to learn. The problem is you're never going to know for sure, are you? This is the tricky thing.
That's what I said.
It might be worth.
But
maybe we'll do something like national parks or something.
That's a good point.
But on a much bigger scale. So we'll keep huge regions of the planet just completely pristine and untouched.
It's difficult to know how interconnected all the aquifer systems might be.
And just the atmosphere, spores and stuff in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one because we could be potentially losing our chance to answer like one of the most interesting and important questions.
Yeah, we might, but if you get to a point where you've done a lot of work there comes a point, right, where you've got to say, okay, enough's enough. We don't think there's anything here. You either get a positive detection early or at some point, and that's fine. But you've got to stop at some point and say, we don't think there's anything here. Because you can't just do it for like 1 million years. And you've covered everywhere on Mars, and you're like, nah, it's just not there, I don't think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we would.
Someone's got to make a cut. Someone's got to cut it off at some point.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're never going to properly colonize Mars.
So that's the question. So is it a reason that we shouldn't ever do it?
And I don't think
it's enough to stop it happening as a reason. Not completely.
No, it's as opposed to it will stop it. Do you think it should stop? Do you think do you personally think that should?
I personally think that. I think it should.
I think it should
slow it.
I
think it should slow it, and we should take a measured and rational scientific approach to it. So we should try to understand the planet as much as possible.
Yeah.
And particularly this question.
Yeah.
Before we just start sending millions of people there.
I mean,
we might not have a choice.
Not have a choice.
It might just start snowballing.
Let's pretend that SpaceX, they do everything they're going to say, and in 20 years they've got this thing going back and forward to Mars that's bringing, what was it, 100? Is it 100?
Yeah, 100 people
100 people at a time. And it costs about $250,000 to start with each. This is what they're saying.
500,000.
500,000.
500,000.
Yeah. A mad amount of money, a crazy amount of money, like a comparatively tiny amount of money is what I mean.
Yeah.
And this price goes down over the next 20 years, and a lot of people are going backwards and forwards. There's not much you can do. There's not much you can do.
No, I mean, the rules are easy to enforce when it's space agencies doing it and scientists going and that, but...
And everyone's on board with the ideas, but once you send a colony there and people potentially start having kids there...
Yeah.
If you get to the size of colonies where that's possible,
Yeah.
and you're not just sterilizing everyone you send, which is
tricky.
Something you might have to think about doing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the science will be ongoing along this process, and it's going to take a very long time to colonize the entire planet. For a long time, there'll be huge expanses of the planet that are just completely untouched.
But we don't. I mean, there is already some Earth life on Mars, probably on some of the not particularly well sterilized rovers that have visited the planet. And the suspicion is that that's not problematic because they're at the surface. There's not much exchange between the subsurface and there is some exchange, but it's probably quite slow. And the surface is a pretty horrible environment. The idea is that most things would be killed on the surface. And you probably wouldn't be infecting deep aquifers. So there is an argument that it's already fucked.
Yeah, or it may well be already.
But you shouldn't. That's not a good enough reason to stop risking the potential science and answer.
This is the thing, that even without the colonization reasons we discussed earlier, the scientific return of sending manned missions to Mars is just so high. Yeah. That I definitely support manned missions to Mars. Yeah. And I support a colony, to be honest. It'd be fucking cool. But I certainly think that it should be, that we should take some kind of measured approach to it. Whether that will actually happen is a different question.
Yes.
The thing is, there is more. So I know what you were saying earlier about building a city over the entire surface, and you'd still be able to access the geology and learn about the geology. So that's less of a concern than the contamination, the biological concern.
It is, unless the biology is tied to the planetary evolution potentially, so you might not fully answer the question. But there's
also, just by being on the planet, interacting with things like aquifers to get water, other sort of reservoirs of stuff that you need for your resources.
Sure.
You're going to be changing, ancient isotope ratios and
True.
stuff like that. That's all going to have information in it from Mars's deep past.
That's true, but
so
I mean,
by doing anything to the planet, you are gradually going to be eroding away at your scientific return.
But I mean, even with, stuff that I've done, science that I've done, looking at certain aquifers that have, actually, they're not exploited for water because they're saline. The ones I'm talking about. But though they have been drained by various processes, but not drained like the aquifers, but some water has been taken
by
out
human activity.
By human activity, and the isotope ratios don't change hugely. They remain. You have to have a big. I mean, you can do that. You can overexploit groundwater and get sinkholes and really reduce the levels. But you could. That's the sort of thing you could take samples of and freeze potentially. Or I think you're right. You probably will spoil some of it, but we managed to learn a lot about Earth's history being covered in humans.
Yeah, and doing crazy all kinds of stuff.
And contaminating with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So
that's very true.
I think we'll probably be okay for geology. It's the life thing I would really worry about. Yeah. The other thing with the life thing, which I mentioned, was that there's some body of evidence that points to life being really important in the development of things like tectonics and all these other processes. So if we don't answer the life question properly, we might not be able to fundamentally answer the planetary evolution questions as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Who knows?
So one final point, actually, related to the fact that geological questions might be slightly more difficult to contaminate than these questions of biology.
Sure.
Is that even if you did contaminate your aquifers on Mars with living sort of bacteria or whatever from Earth, you still would probably be able to answer the question of ancient sort of fossilized life. You'd be able to discover...
That's a great point.
Like life from the Noachian, so like billions of years ago.
Yes.
Which actually was probably when Mars was much more habitable and might be the only life you would ever find on Mars would be ancient anyway. So
yes, or fossils. That's a great point.
Yeah.
And that's something. Yeah, you would not need to particularly worry about that.
Yeah.
And you could still answer the question: had you covered the entire planet in a 10-inch thick layer of just shit? Just pure shit.
Yeah, let's not do that. That would be fucking grim.
You would still be fine to answer that question, probably.
Yeah.
So,
but so that's fine, but it's still not a good enough reason. I mean, we still need to worry about the potential for, damaging extant life.
Oh yeah.
Because that's potentially even more of a scientific return.
Sure.
Extant Martian life.
Yes. Yeah.
Fine, delicious extant life.
Yeah, I agree. So I think our overall opinion of that point, of that argument against going there, that we should preserve it, is that that I think it's still too valuable. I think that the reasons to make a colony permanently are too valuable to ignore when put up against that. But we should take it slowly and be very careful and try and maximise scientific return without screwing it up.
Yeah, we should be very aware that
there is a risk there, a big
be very
risk.
diligent about it.